We often think about going to the theater to see a play as the kind of event that you dress up for. With the exception of school plays and free performances such as Shakespeare in the Park, drama can seem like a kind of high art targeted at snobby rich people. But during Shakespeare's life, it was a very different story. For professional theater in early modern London, we have reliable beginning and ending dates because in 1576, the first permanent structure built only for putting on plays was completed. Aptly named the theater, it established some of the design elements that appeared in other public outdoor theaters in the decades to come, including the Globe. Shakespeare was born in 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, and while we don't know much about his early life, he started writing plays for professional London actors in the late 1580s or early 1590s. Shakespeare is often associated with Elizabethan theater, and Queen Elizabeth reigned from 1558 until her death in 1603. But then James I became the King of England in 1603 until his death in 1625. So many of Shakespeare's best-known plays are Jacobean rather than Elizabethan. Here's a map of early modern London that points out various performance spaces, such as public theaters. Notice that most of the purpose-built theaters were either north of the wall or south of the River Thames. The performance spaces inside the wall are inns, churches, or guild halls. That's because when professional theater was first trying to establish itself in London during the 1570s and 80s, most city officials and many other people in power didn't want it. The Lord Mayor and other officials tended to be what we would now call Puritans, and they thought of plays as an evil, corrupting influence. Actors were called players, and although professional players could make a living, many people considered them to be not workers, but rather vagrants, pickpockets, and tricksters. Playhouses were seen as centers of corruption and thought of as similar to brothels and gambling houses. So when someone wanted to build a playhouse like the Theatre or the Globe, they had to place it above the wall or below the river so that it was out of the jurisdiction of the London authorities, who wanted to get rid of playing entirely. One of Shakespeare's early contemporaries, a playwright named Christopher Marlowe, was called a poet and a filthy playmaker by someone critical of the theater. He wasn't a filthy playmaker because he wrote filthy plays, but because playmaking, writing plays, was seen as a filthy occupation. By contrast, poetry was an established and respected art form. So being a poet was fine, but being a playmaker was filthy. Shakespeare's acting company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, was established in 1594, 1 year after Marlowe's death. An aristocrat such as the Lord Chamberlain became a patron of a company in order to offer the players some protection from the authorities that wanted to shut them down. Shareholding members of the company were even given livery, a kind of uniform that identified them as servants to the Lord Chamberlain. They didn't actually serve in the Lord Chamberlain's household, and in fact they don't appear to have received any money from the Lord Chamberlain, just the livery and some protection from authorities. The shareholders were permanent members of the acting company, 8 to 12 men who played the major roles in any play and shared the profits from performance. Shakespeare was a shareholder, or sharer, in the Lord Chamberlain's Men. So he was an actor as well as a playwright, and he made money from plays in ways that other playwrights could not. Shakespeare became the wealthiest playwright in early modern London, but not exactly because of his plays. When someone wrote a play, they would try to sell it to an acting company for not a whole lot of money. And if a company bought it, that company would then own the play and the right to make or even publish copies of it. Modern copyright didn't exist, so when the author sold the play, they also sold all of their rights to it. Playwrights didn't make much money, and most had to have other sources of income. But Shakespeare was a sharer in the most successful professional playing company in the period. He didn't make much money for selling the plays he wrote to the company, but the company was very profitable. When the Globe Theatre was built in 1599, it was owned by the Lord Chamberlain's Men. Other companies might have to pay half of their profit to the landlord who owned the theater they were at, but Shakespeare's company were their own landlords. They were one of the two most popular playing companies, and they shared most of the profits amongst themselves. After James I ascended the throne in 1603, the Lord Chamberlain's Men became the King's Men. The records show that they were invited to perform for the royal court more than all of the other London playing companies combined. This is an image of a modern reconstruction of the Globe Theatre, called Shakespeare's Globe, in London. The audience is standing on the ground surrounding the stage on three sides. Then along the outer wall there are three tiers of seats. The stage is relatively low and small, with one door on each side of the stage and a slightly larger reveal space in the center, where large props like thrones or beds could emerge from. You see several performers in the above space, in center, and more audience members can sit on both sides of that space, on the second floor of the tiring house, where actors put on their attire to perform different characters. Here's another angle on the same performance. The ceiling above the stage was called the heavens, and ropes and pulleys allowed performers to descend from the heavens to the center of the stage, which was often used for Roman gods or other supernatural beings. There was also a trapdoor in the center of the stage where characters could go to or come from hell. Thinking about Shakespeare's original audiences, there's still some debate over how many people, aside from the aristocrats and wealthy merchants, were in attendance. We know that laborers and apprentices went to plays, and that attending a play at a public outdoor theater like the Globe was fairly affordable. 1 penny to be a groundling standing around the stage, 2 pence for a ground level seat along the outer wall, another penny for the floor above, 4 pence for a top tier seat, or 6 pence to sit in the Lord's box, those seats on both sides of the above space, looming over the stage itself. Here's a cutaway diagram of the Globe, and you can see the tiring house, the heavens, the space below the stage, and the 3 tiers of seats along the outer wall. Also notice the curtain covering the reveal space instead of a door, which is probably how it would have normally appeared in the early modern period. Actors on stage were surrounded by audience members on 3 or even all 4 sides, so there were no sets or backgrounds. Only playgoers on one of those sides would have seen the tiring house behind the actors. Everyone else saw more members of the audience when they looked past the actors on stage. Performing in daylight in an outdoor theater meant that everybody could see everyone else throughout the play, so players were always aware of the audience, and the audience was always aware of the audience, in a way that modern theaters work against. It also gives performance a different flavor when actors can make eye contact with members of the audience everywhere they turn. For wealthy people in the audience, one of the appeals of playgoing was to be seen and to show off expensive clothing. All clothing was handmade and a costly expense. In fact, the costumes worn by the players were all real clothes, and they easily amounted to the highest cost of putting on a play. Sometimes people described going to the playhouse as going to hear a play. Plays could certainly be spectacular with special effects and fancy costumes, but most of the lines in most professional plays were written in blank verse, poetry, that could often dazzle or amuse the ear. Sitting in the Lord's box beside the above space offered a pretty good view, except of the tiring house and its reveal space. In some sense, then, the groundlings standing around the stage had the best seats in the house, but the Lord's box probably was one of the best places to be able to hear the players deliver their lines. As for how long plays lasted, there continues to be some disagreement amongst scholars. Evidence from the period suggests that most plays lasted 2 to 3 hours. Some plays by Shakespeare and Ben Jonson tend to run longer than that, which raises questions about adding material to a play before publishing it as a playbook, which we know Jonson did. A counterpoint, though, is that early modern London English sounds different than modern London English. Linguists have helped stage modern productions in what they call original pronunciation. They found that changing the accent and pronunciation in even a relatively short play like Romeo and Juliet shaved off 10 minutes of performance time. So it could be that plays took less time because, in some sense, the players simply spoke faster. There's also the issue of time at the theater, which some accounts describe as taking all afternoon, as much as 6 hours. Some evidence suggests that there were entertainments before and after a play, perhaps including juggling, joke-telling, and more. Most interestingly, we know that at the end of each and every play, the actors came on stage and danced a jig, a kind of lively country dance. That means that even at the end of a tragedy, like Hamlet or Othello, everyone, including Desdemona, Othello, and Iago, would get up and start dancing on stage. This is an image of another reconstructed early modern theater, the Blackfriars. The Blackfriars was an indoor or private playhouse where boys' companies performed plays in the 1590s and early 1600s, and where Shakespeare's company, the King's Men, started performing regularly in 1608. Indoor theaters were smaller, but they were profitable because they were closer to wealthier parts of London, and they charged more for admission. You can see how small the stage was at the Blackfriars. This reconstruction, called the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse in London, adds a bit of extra authenticity by using real candles for lighting. Printed playbooks in the 1580s and 90s mostly just used scene divisions, but as performances at indoor theaters became increasingly common, English playbooks increasingly used a 5-act structure. At the Blackfriars, the interval between each of the 5 acts was used to trim the candles, to maintain light and avoid a fire hazard. Musicians played music during the intervals too, so later plays often incorporate more music than earlier ones. The instruments mentioned in stage directions changed as well. Loud horns gave way to softer strings in Jacobean playtexts. Here is a reconstructed Blackfriars in Stanton, Virginia. It cannot use real candles because of fire codes, but the image allows you to see the similar layout of the tiring house and the audience to what was common in the outdoor theaters. There are benches to sit in the front and 2 tiers of seating on both sides of the stage. We don't have evidence of audience members sitting in the above space in a private theater, but the reason why you see stools along the sides of the stage in this picture is because the most expensive seats at the Blackfriars were the stools where people could literally sit on stage during a performance. Some plays written for the Blackfriars eventually made use of this by including dialogue for actors who were supposed to sit on some of the stools and act like members of the audience. With probably the coolest title ever, the Master of the Revels was the member of the royal court who arranged entertainments for holiday celebration and other occasions. For example, around Christmas time, the court might celebrate for several days in a row with plays and masks on some of those days. The Master of the Revels also licensed plays for performance on the public stage, so he had an opportunity to censor material before it could be performed. Surviving records show that the kinds of material that had to be excised or changed was what he was concerned might start a riot or piss off the Spanish ambassador. There were some apprentice riots that broke out in London for various reasons, so officials were concerned about triggering more, and the Spanish ambassador made a fuss on at least one occasion that led to a boys' company getting into trouble with King James himself. Overall, though, playwrights mostly knew the kind of material they could and couldn't get away with, and on the occasions when someone did cross the line, they were imprisoned or forced to lay low to avoid being imprisoned. Today, many people have at some point learned that all of the women's roles in Shakespeare's plays were played by boys, but most people don't know why. Remember that professional theater in London was trying to establish itself in a hostile environment. Many players were former tradesmen who were members of London guilds. There was no players' guild, but the players followed guild practices as another way to try to gain social acceptance. Most of the guilds in London did not allow women to join them, even though there were many women working in trades and various businesses. All of the guilds used an apprenticeship model to train young people into the trade who would eventually become full members of the guild. So instead of considering the use of women actors, professional players simply took on apprentices in the guild to which they belonged. But rather than teaching an apprentice how to be a goldsmith or a grocer, the professional player who performed 6 days a week had his apprentice playing women's roles in each of those plays, apprenticing the boys to eventually become professional actors and possibly sharers in the company. Apprentices were a cheap and dependable source of labor, and following the guild model lent professional players a further air of respectability. Shakespeare himself wasn't in a guild. He was the son of a glover, so his father made fine leather goods in Stratford-upon-Avon. But many fellow playwrights and actors were tradesmen and guild members. The actors who first played Juliet, Ophelia, Rosalind, Viola, and Desdemona were 14, 15, or 16-year-old boys apprenticed to John Hemming or one of the other sharers in Shakespeare's company. As the son of a glover, Shakespeare grew up in a tradesman's house and was fortunate that his father saved enough money to send him to a local grammar school that happened to be one of the best in England. The grammar school education meant that Shakespeare learned Latin well enough to translate it, but he hadn't learned much Greek. The college education would have included more study of Greek, but Shakespeare didn't attend college. Fellow playwright Ben Jonson later scoffed that Shakespeare knew little Latin and less Greek, but this was somewhat ironic because Jonson also never attended college. Shakespeare's father was a prosperous tradesman, eventually becoming an alderman, a prominent city official in Stratford-upon-Avon. John Shakespeare applied for a coat of arms, an expensive social marker that would have officially made him a gentleman. He died before the coat of arms was approved, but it was granted and passed down to his son William. William Shakespeare designed it and likely came up with the family motto, non sans droit, Old French meaning not without right. Here's a drawing of it, found in archival documents only as recently as 2016. The document identifies Shakespeare the player above his coat of arms. This is one of only 2 surviving color images from Shakespeare's lifetime. With the money Shakespeare accumulated as a sharer in the Lord Chamberlain's men, he bought the second largest house in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1597. A few years later, he was granted his father's coat of arms, and after James ascended the throne in 1603, the company he shared in was granted a royal patent as the King's Men. The years after, they went on to perform for royal court more than any other playing company. It has been said by recent scholars that Shakespeare was a court dramatist. Others have argued that after the King's Men started performing at the more exclusive indoor playhouse, the Blackfriars, Shakespeare's plays catered more to the wealthy audiences there than to larger crowds in attendance at the Globe. Yet in the years after the company started performing at the Blackfriars, they continued performing at the Globe as well. And when the Globe caught fire during a performance and burned down in 1613, the King's Men put in an exorbitant amount of money and time into rebuilding it in brick. At some point, the sharers in the company might have accumulated enough wealth that they no longer would have had to make a living by performing for the masses at an outdoor public theater. But they continued to, even at great expense to the company. The brick Globe was finished in 1614 at the end of Shakespeare's career. He died in 1616 back home in Stratford-upon-Avon. Early modern theater didn't end when Shakespeare died. It continued on during James's reign until 1625 when he died, and when James's son Charles ascended the throne in 1625, the theater continued as Caroline drama, with new playwrights and new plays coming out up until 1642, when the theaters were officially closed. In 1642, we've got a definitive year for the end of early modern London theater, because at that point, the Puritans in Parliament had gained so much power, they had such a majority in Parliament, that they were able to pass a law closing down all of the theaters and officially ending professional theater in London in particular, and supposedly throughout the country. So those Puritans that had been trying to get rid of all the players way back in the 1570s and 1580s finally succeeded by 1642. Charles I remained king until 1649, when he was beheaded by an act of Parliament. Tensions had grown so much between the Puritans in Parliament and the monarchy that there was an English Civil War. So at that point, Oliver Cromwell, took over as Lord Protector, and the English government became a Commonwealth for 11 years, until in 1660, Charles's son returned to England and ascended the throne as King Charles II. England turned back into a monarchy, and the theaters were reopened, the restoration of the monarchy. So at that point, it was Restoration Theater. And finally, thanks to Charles II, women were allowed to perform on the public stage.